They told me that Guinness was much better when it didn't come out of a can that had traveled across the Atlantic Ocean, and they were right. It's much better. Well, I want to thank Rob and Greg for the invitation to participate with you in Rubicon. And I think I'd like to start by talking about beauty will save the world. 1,000 years ago, Prince Vladimir, the pagan monarch of the Ukraine, was in search of a new religion. He wanted to unite the disparate peoples of Rus. He wanted to create a unified Russia. Toward this end, he was looking for a religion. You might say he was in the market for a religion, something that he could use to unite these people. And so he commissioned an investigative report, and people traveled throughout the realms and came back and gave their reports there in Kiev to Prince Vladimir. Some had found religions that were dour and austere. Some had found religions that were ephemeral and esoteric. But those that had gone to Constantinople came and gave this report. They said, when the Christians took us into their place of worship, we no longer knew whether we were in heaven or on earth. All we knew is we were overwhelmed by the beauty. And we can never forget that beauty. Prince Vladimir made his decision. He said, I want that religion of beauty. And this is how Christianity first came to Russia 1,000 years ago. 900 years or so later, Fyodor Dostoevsky, in 1881, was writing his... 900 years later, after Prince Vladimir had embraced Christianity, Fyodor Dostoevsky was finishing his novel, The Idiot. In The Idiot, Dostoevsky attempts to create a perfectly beautiful character, actually a Christ figure, Prince Mishkin. Throughout the novel, really in only about 4 or 5 places, it's reported that Prince Mishkin would say, beauty will save the world. Just sort of a mysterious, enigmatic phrase. It's never developed. We're never told exactly what Prince Mishkin means by that. It's just simply, beauty will save the world. When Alexander Solzhenitsyn was accepting the Nobel Prize for Literature, he made reference to that little obscure reference in Dostoevsky's The Idiot and said, it's not a riddle, it's a prophecy. Beauty will save the world. I think that as we now cross the Rubicon into a postmodern world, those of us that are at all interested in the preservation of faith and Christian faith need to pay attention to what Dostoevsky channeled through his character, Prince Mishkin, and what Alexander Solzhenitsyn said was not a riddle but a prophecy. Beauty will save the world. The Greek philosophers spoke about the 3 prime virtues, the true, the good, and the beautiful. As virtues, the Greek philosophers would say, these are things that need no other justification. Their own reality is their justification. In other words, we want the true because it is true. We want the good for its own sake because it is good. We want the beautiful because it is beautiful. Later, The early church fathers would speak of the good and the true and the beautiful as attributes of the divine, attributes of God. Now, throughout the centuries, the church has made a good deal about at least two of those virtues. And so we have a very developed body of work in, for example, Christian apologetics, the defense of Christian truth. And there's whole libraries on that, you know. We also have Christian ethics. That is, through a lens of Christian faith, how do we understand what is the good? What is good for society? What is good for the human being? But I think, at least in the modern era, we have sort of succumbed to the idea that beauty is little more than mere adornment, and it's been somewhat set aside. But that brings us to this present moment, here in this postmodern age where it's very pronounced, certainly in North America and Western Europe, where the wider culture is, perhaps rightfully so, suspicious of our claims to absolute truth. I'm not saying those are illegitimate claims, I'm just saying the wider society is not convinced by it, and yet another argument probably is not going to change their mind. And in a wider society that is indeed, and I think certainly legitimately, suspicious of any kind of Christian claim to a superior morality, that perhaps what we need to do is focus on that third virtue, beauty. So along with Christian apologetics and Christian ethics, as legitimate as those are, maybe we can set that aside and say, what if we attempted to understand and communicate Christian faith through Christian aesthetics, the beautiful? Instead of arguing about truth, or in my North American context, trying to legislate our version of what we consider the good, what if we went about attempting to embody the beautiful? Beauty is a bit difficult to define, though. I use the word, and you have an idea of what it is. I think most of us, I know what the beautiful is. But if you try to define it, it's very difficult. And in fact, there are very few adjectives in the English language or synonyms for beautiful. It seems to just be its own kind of word. But whatever we mean by beauty, we are talking about shape and form of some sort. So that whether we're talking about a painting or a poem, a song or a sculpture, it has something to do with the shape or the form that makes something beautiful. If you distort the form or the shape of the poem or the painting or the song or the sculpture, you begin to mar its beauty. So there is a beautiful form. Well, if we're going to try to engage the wider culture in a beautiful form, we need to find the original form of Christian beauty. And of course, this is going to be related to the life of Jesus. And one of the most astounding things about Jesus is that virtually no one is a critic of Jesus. Critics of the church, yes, indeed, certainly. Critics of Christianity as it has developed, absolutely. But Jesus himself remains deeply admired. I don't really know any serious critics of Jesus. As they begin to criticize Jesus, they begin to sound silly even in their own ears. And Nietzsche tried. Nietzsche would try to rail against Christ and then would change his mind and think he was the greatest man that ever lived. He kind of bounced back and forth and could never really convince himself that he ought to be attacking Jesus. So we ask the question, is there a place in the life of Jesus that we can say that is quintessential? This is the moment that captures who Jesus is. Well, for we who are perhaps believers, I think we are rightly drawn to the cross, to Christ upon the cross. That this is a summation of Jesus' life. When Jesus begins his ministry, he begins by a proclamation of who will be the most likely to receive and embrace and be happy by this announcement that God's kingdom, God's government, God's reign, God's rule was now breaking into the world through what he was doing. He said things like, well, happy are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And happy are those who mourn, for they're going to be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who just hunger and ache and thirst for things to be set right. They're going to find satisfaction with what I'm doing. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, they'll see God at work where others don't. Blessed are the peacemakers, they'll be called the children of God, engaged in the family business. Yes, and blessed are those who are suffering persecution for the sake of justice, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And Jesus not only proclaims this, he enacts this in his radical hospitality of inviting all and receiving all who will come to his table. And then it reaches its crescendo at the cross, where with his arms outstretched in proffered embrace, he prays, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. That is the form of Christian beauty. It is the cruciform. Again, I'm an American, and so I'm speaking a little bit from my own context, but perhaps you'll relate. I'm very much dismayed that in my own country, Christian witness has been communicated more with a furrowed brow or a clenched fist or a wagging finger instead of like this. And instead of fighting for our rights and insisting upon our hearing, we simply seek to embody a cruciform beauty. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Beauty. So as we go about our work, those of us that are engaged in such things, of trying to communicate Christian faith in a secular society, along with asking ourselves, well, is it true what we're doing? Is it good? We might also ask, is it beautiful? That is, would the common person look at what we're doing and say, now that, right there, that is beautiful. Of course, that the cross has become a kind of emblem of beauty and hope and faith is truly a remarkable thing, you know. The cross begins as, well, it's a form of psychological terror that the empire used upon the occupied to keep them under their thumb. Crucifixion, employed by the Romans, was not an efficient way of killing people, and the Romans were very efficient in killing people. But it was a terrorizing way to execute those that were some kind of threat to imperial power. And so the cross itself was a hideous thing, repellent. And yet it's been transformed into, many here will have a cross as some form of ornament, an object of beauty around your neck, and rightfully so. Because Christ has transformed this emblem of death and psychological terror into an emblem of beauty and hope and life and salvation. But he does that by what he accomplished there, and that is absorbing hate, absorbing sin, and recycling it into the beauty of forgiveness. We even have learned how to take the portrait of Jesus' death, which was a state-sponsored execution, and turn it into something beautiful. I suppose perhaps it's been the subject of more works of art than anything in history. I'm thinking of Giotto's Crucified Christ. And it's actually beautiful. It's true. It's a work of art. I think most people would look at it and say, that's a beautiful. But what are you seeing? You're seeing the state-sponsored execution of a supposed criminal. Now, here's the thing. There was a time in my life when I thought, well, it didn't look like that. I would see these paintings, from the Renaissance masters and from the Middle Ages of Christ crucified. And yes, I would recognize there's artistic beauty there, but I would say it's not true to what happened. And so I sort of resisted that, a very, very Protestant sort of thing to do. But then later on I realized that it is not the task of the artist to give us a journalistic reproduction. It's the task of the artist to show us what we've overlooked. For example, Van Gogh's Starry Night. I think most of you probably would remember that painting, be able to conjure that in your mind. I think it's Van Gogh's most famous painting, Starry Night. Well, that's not exactly what a starry night looks like. I mean, if you look at Van Gogh's Starry Night and then look at the sky in sort of a comparative, even though it doesn't look like that, but that's not what Van Gogh's up to. Van Gogh is trying to remind you, hey, don't forget the wonder of the night sky. See it also with your heart. And so that when I look at it, I go, he's right. It does evoke that kind of wonder. If I'll just lose myself in the majesty and the glory and the mystery of the night sky. If we did have a journalistic photograph of the crucifixion of Christ, it would indeed be ugly. And if you ever looked at it, you would wish you hadn't and never look at it again. But what the artists have done is give us a portrayal of what could not be seen at that level. And that is the love of God absorbing the sin of the world and recycling it into the free offer of forgiveness and pardon and the beginning of a new world. I'm very interested about the time in which we live. It seems as if we are living in a time of deconstruction, certainly in the Western world. And you kind of wonder, when is it going to stop? I mean, how far down are we going to be deconstructed until we can begin to build again? And yet perhaps it's necessary. And so I remain full of hope. One of my favorite novelists is Salman Rushdie, Indian in birth, but now has lived for many years in England. He wrote Midnight's Children, Shalimar the Clown, Ground Beneath Her Feet, The Moor's Last Sigh, one of my favorite authors. And I go to India fairly often. And not too long ago, I was coming back from India, one of those long flights from New Delhi to New York, 14 hours in the air. And I had a book of essays by Salman Rushdie. Not a novel, but just some essays he had written. And he had written an essay on the Taj Mahal. And I've seen the Taj Mahal a time or two, and it's truly perhaps the most beautiful edifice in all of the world. And he'd written a few lines on the Taj Mahal. And I was reading it on this long flight, but really my mind had been occupied by the kind of things we've been talking about today. I mean, in the postmodern world, how can we recapture the beauty of Christ? Salman Rushdie, who is not a believer. He's just talking about the Taj Mahal, but you'll have to imagine how I hear it as pertaining to Jesus. He writes, "The problem with the Taj Mahal is that it has become so overlaid with accumulated meanings as to be almost impossible to see." I've just arrived in Ireland, but I've been all the way up to Belfast and back, and everywhere I go, I see churches. They're quite old. My guess would be that tomorrow they will not be overflowing. That's my guess. I don't know for sure. But the problem with the Taj Mahal is that it's become so overlaid with accumulated meanings as to be almost impossible to see. When you arrive at the outer walls of the gardens in which the Taj is set, it's as if every hustler and hawker and angler is awaiting for you to make the familiarity breeds contempt problem worse, peddling imitation mahals of every size and price. This leads to a certain amount of shoulder-shrugging disenchantment. I remember the first time I took Perry to the Taj Mahal, and she had that very experience that it almost ruined it for her because she had to push her way through everybody that was trying to sell her something. Recently, a British friend who was about to make his first visit to India told me he had decided to leave the Taj off his itinerary because of its overexposure. If I urged him not to, it's because of my own vivid memory of pushing my way for the first time through the jostling crowd of imitation vendors, past all the myriad hawkers of meaning and interpretation, into the presence of the thing itself, which utterly overwhelmed me and made all my notions about its devaluation feel totally and completely redundant. The building itself left my skepticism in shreds, announcing itself as itself, insisting with absolute force on its sovereign authority. It simply obliterated the million counterfeits of it and glowingly filled once and forever the place in the mind previously occupied by its simulacra. For those of us that are perhaps interested in the hope that Christianity could once again take root now in a postmodern world, here is my advice. Play the Jesus card every chance you get. He's the best thing we have going. We have much to be embarrassed about, much to apologize for, much to maybe even be ashamed of as Christians, but not Jesus. He's beautiful. He remains beautiful. And if we can just point people in that and perhaps in some ways begin to embody some of that kind of beauty, I think there is hope that people will once again encounter Christ in saving ways. So I'd like to maybe just close this little talk by telling a story, a true story. It really happened. But it's also a metaphor. I think it's an appropriate metaphor for as the church is crossing the Rubicon from modernity to post-modernity. Is there a way that once again we might awaken interest in faith, and particularly in Christ? Well, here's the story. It really happened. I can tell you exactly when it happened. It happened October 8th, 2004 in Paris, France. And I remember the date because it was the day that Derrida died, Jacques Derrida, the founder of deconstruction theory and philosophy. Perhaps no one would be a better representative figure of postmodernity than Jacques Derrida. And it was the day he had died. And I was in Paris, and that's where Derrida had died, and I was reading about it in the papers. I was there speaking, and that evening I had some time. I was free that evening. I was staying up in the north, up by Saint-Denis, and I wanted to visit Notre Dame Cathedral because I had received a leaflet earlier in the week that they were having a multimedia presentation on the history of the cathedral. And so I took the RER train into the city center to go to Notre Dame to see this presentation. I got to the city a bit early. I got to the cathedral a bit ahead of time, and I had some time to kill, so I went across the river there on the left bank to where the very famous English-speaking bookstore is, Shakespeare and Company. Very well-known bookstore. It's featured in Woody Allen's latest film, Midnight in Paris. It was where people like James Joyce and Ezra Pound and Ernest Hemingway used to hang out. And my thinking was, well, I'll get something to read on the way back, because I had left without having any reading material. And so I browsed around a bit in Shakespeare and Company and ended up purchasing a copy of Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Idiot, the book from which the line, "Beauty will save the world," comes. Now, purchasing a paperback copy of that book for 12 euros was really sort of an extravagant gesture on my part because I already had a copy of The Idiot in my hotel room. But my thinking was, well, I could knock out 45 more minutes of The Idiot. I know it's very extravagant, but it's central to my story. So I purchased the paperback copy of The Idiot, and The Idiot and I then went across the river to Notre Dame Cathedral. We sat there for the hour-long presentation. It was mostly about the actual construction of the cathedral, and this was one of the first and perhaps the greatest Gothic cathedral. It did mention, though, about how Christianity had come to Gaul in the 3rd century. And St. Denis came and announced Jesus. But it was mostly about the building itself. And yet, despite the fact that it had virtually no religious content, at the end of it, for whatever reason, I just felt moved. There was not very many people there. There was, a handful of people in this vast cathedral, and the lights were down low, and I was sitting by one of those tremendous columns, and I just bowed my head and prayed the simplest of prayers. I just simply prayed, God, use me more in this city. Amen. That's all I prayed. And The Idiot and I, we left Notre Dame. And I got on the train. I was getting ready to go back to my hotel, and I sat down and began to read. We went a stop or two, and people come and go, and I was oblivious to it all, until a young man sat opposite me. An Asian man, young man in his 20s. And he spoke to me and he said, "Oh, that's a very good book you're reading there." I said, "The Idiot? Yeah, you've read it?" He said, "I'm reading it right now." I thought, well, that's kind of a coincidence. And we began to talk. And we talked first about, a little bit about The Idiot, and then I don't know how it came up, but somehow, we talked about the fact that Jacques Derrida had died this very day. And we talked about deconstruction philosophy a little bit, and he told me some of the other authors he liked. I remember he mentioned Gabriel Garcia Marquez, author of 100 Years of Solitude, one of my favorite novels. So we were connecting, on literature and some things like that. And then I asked him, I said, "What are you doing in Paris?" And he said, "Well, I just graduated from college and I'm backpacking across Europe." I said, "Man, that's awesome. I envy you. That's tremendous. What was your degree in?" And he said, "Well, I earned 2 degrees. And I thought, wow, real go-getter here. And I said, "What were your 2 degrees in?" And he said, "Political science and world history." I said, "That's a marvelous combination of degrees because political science is the attempt of man to govern himself, and world history is the record of our failures to do so." And he laughed. He said, "Yeah, that's about right." And then I asked him, I said, "Now, here you are, a young man, you're bright, and you got the life, your future stretches out in front of you, and you know a bit about political science and world history. What hope do you have for this world?" And he said, "Oh, I have no hope for the world. I'm very pessimistic. I have no hope for the world." I thought, well, it's a little bit sad. And I said that to him. I said, "That's a little bit sad." And then he said, so we returned to the book there at hand, The Idiot. He said, I heard that, and this is the very language he used. These are his words. "I heard that Fyodor Dostoevsky was a born-again Christian. Do you know anything about that?" I said, "Well, I might." And so I just basically told him Dostoevsky's own story about having grown up in a religious home and then wandering away from that, getting involved with kind of a subversive writers group in Tsarist Russia, getting in trouble for that, getting in a lot of trouble, being arrested, put in the St. Peter and Paul fortress, and sentenced to execution when he was 27 years old. And indeed, he was taken there from the prison out to the parade ground, with all the due ceremony, and he was blindfolded, and the firing squad was there, and the various commands were given, and he just knew that any moment his life was over, because any moment the commander would speak the word fire, and at the last moment there was a horse came galloping into the parade ground. Halt, 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 halt. The Tsar has commuted their sentence. 4 years hard labor in Siberia. Actually, it was all a ruse, but they didn't know it at the time. That was always going to be the sentence, but they didn't know that. And so Dostoevsky talks about being a man who really thought that he'd come to the end of his life, and suddenly his whole life is given back to him. He was clamped into leg irons and in the dead of winter whisked away in a sled to Siberia. He bore the scars of those leg irons for the rest of his life. But as he was going into the prison, he was given a book. It was the New Testament. Remember, I'm telling this to, the young man's name on the train is you, which makes telling the story a little bit funny. So anyway, I was telling this to you on the train in Paris on the day that Derrida died. And I was telling him about Dostoevsky and how when he went into the prison, he was given a New Testament. And this very literate man, the only thing he had to read for 4 years was the New Testament. And he particularly fell in love with the Gospels, and especially the Gospel of John. And it was through this experience of suffering and reading the beautiful portrayal of Christ through the artistry of the Gospel of John that Dostoevsky's faith revived. And then I began to explain to you on the train in Paris on the day that Derrida died that Prince Myshkin is in fact a figure of Christ as beautiful. And that's when you asked me, what do you do? I said, well, I'm a pastor. And he said, no way. Which I gotta admit, it actually made me feel good, Rob. Because I don't mind being a pastor, I just don't want to look like one, all right? And then he became quite serious and he said, well, since you're a pastor, I'll tell you something. I grew up in a Catholic home, but in high school I lost my faith. And I became an atheist. And all through college I've been an atheist, rather outspoken at times. But yesterday, I went to visit Notre Dame Cathedral. You understand, I only did it to see the architecture. I said, I understand. He said, but when I arrived at the cathedral and walked in, by the way, the effect of the Gothic cathedral upon the visitor is that it simply forces you almost to do this. I've experimented with it. I've stood in these great Gothic cathedrals. I've just stood in there and watched people come in, especially the tourists, you know, which is who comes. And they walk in, and it's every time it's, and there's this sort of, well, you said to me when I got to the cathedral and walked in, I knew there is a God. And I knew that I was mistaken. I knew I was wrong. And so I tried to pray and I tried to tell God I was sorry, but I don't think God heard my prayer. That's what you said to me on the train in Paris on the day Derrida died. And I said, let me tell you something. I just came from that cathedral. I was just there. And I too prayed a prayer. And my prayer was, God, use me more in this city. From what I know about God, He's very economical in answering prayers. He's never extravagant about it. But I think it might have been something like this. Wait a minute. I can answer both prayers at the same time. And so I bought this book, I have one in my hotel, a nice hardback with a silk ribbon and everything. But I had to buy it, didn't I? So you would see it. So you would remark upon it. And we would talk about Dostoevsky and Prince Mishkin and talk about Derrida and talk about political science and world history, and you have no hope. And what do? And Notre Dame. So that I could tell you there is hope for the world. And it's the same hope that Fyodor Dostoevsky had. And it's the hope that I have. And it's the hope of the beauty of Jesus Christ. Beauty will save the world. It's not pounding our fist and insisting that we're right. It's not wagging our finger and telling the rest of the world they're wrong. It's being enchanted by the beauty of Christ. Cervantes in Don Quixote said, it is the prerogative of beauty to charm hearts. And I talked to you about the hope of the world is Jesus Christ. And then he said to me, would you pray for me? And I said, I'll pray for you. And we bowed our heads on that train and I prayed. And just as I said amen, I'd sort of lost time. I was very excited about what was happening. It felt so significant. Even in that moment, I thought this was something like a metaphor. Derrida has died, and we're in Paris, and a young Catholic who's lost his faith, and now he's expressing interest once again because he saw the beauty of Notre Dame Cathedral, and I can say something about you. I was aware of this moment being somewhat significant as a metaphor. And as I said amen, I looked, oh, that's my stop. I said, I have to go. And I just got off the train, and off he went. And I stood on that platform, and I felt like an angel. I was like, oh, yes. An angel. People asked me, they said, did you get his email? I said, angels don't ask for email. I don't know what became of him. I never even learned what country he was. I know he was from Asia, but I don't know. I never got the country. But I think about him all the time. And I just like to think that somewhere, maybe in Hong Kong, there's a young man. Well, he'd be in his 30s by now. Maybe he's somewhere with a conference going on. I don't know. He's articulate. I remember that about him. Maybe he's saying, well, I was in Paris on the day that Derrida died. And I had no hope. But I went to a beautiful cathedral, and then I met an angel on a train. Beauty will save the world. Maybe we can set aside asserting the truth of it all, even though I believe it's true. Maybe we can lighten up on insisting upon Christian ethics, although I believe in that too. Maybe we can simply attempt to embody the beauty of Christ, because beauty will save the world. Amen.